Coming up next, Eric Smith. Later, Dora gets grounded. On Goanimate Network.
Coming up next, Penny and Mitch. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, The Keith Jones Show.
Later, Oscar and Dodo. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, it's Angry Birds 2. Later, The Jessica Andrews Show. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, it's The P-Head Show. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, The Adventures of Dallas. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Battle of Dream Island. Later, Danny Dog. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Danny Dog.
Later, P-Head Show. On Goanimate Network.
Coming up next, Foster's Home for Imagery Friends. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Animation. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Little Bill Gets Grounded. Later, GNN News. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Jessica Andrews Christmas Special. Later, The Kaylu Gets Grounded Christmas Ground. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Dora Gets Grounded. Later, Angry Birds 2. On Goanimate Network.
Coming up next, Codename Kids Next Door on Goanimate Network.
Coming up next, Danny Dog. Later, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends Christmas Special Lost Clause. On Goanimate Network.
Coming up next, The Keith Jones Show on Goanimate Network.
Coming up next, GNN News. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Penny and Mitch. Later, Adventures of Dallas. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Oscar and Dodo. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, SpongeBob SquarePants. Later, For You Grits. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Cat Dog. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Ed, Edd and Eddy. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, Teen Titans. Later, Looney Tunes. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, GNN News. Later, The Cartoon Show. On Goanimate Network. Coming up next, The P-Head Show. Later, The 8 O'Clock Movie. On Goanimate Network.